Welcome to the Cyber Center for Biblical Studies. Hi, my name is Herb Bateman. Today we want to look at an Old Testament prophet, the prophet Isaiah. And today, to help stimulate our thinking about Isaiah, we have with us Dr. Bob Chisholm, Old Testament professor at Dallas Theological Seminary, to give us some insights into the book of Isaiah. Bob, welcome.
Hi, Herb. Look
All
forward
right.
to chatting with you
about
the great prophet Isaiah.
Yes, and a very long book.
66 chapters.
66 chapters. Well, as you think about these 66 chapters in Isaiah, what would you say is the big idea for the Isaiah, and how does that book fit into God's bigger narrative story in Scripture at large?
Okay. If it's hard to boil the message of 66 chapters down to a summary statement, but I actually have done this for classes that I teach, and I wrote a short chapter on the theology of Isaiah way back when. And the way I would state the main message of Isaiah is what we see in Isaiah is God reclaiming his covenant people. He has to discipline them severely for their rebellion against him. And we read about that primarily in the first 39 chapters of Isaiah, how the Lord eventually sends his people into exile in Babylon. But that's not the end of the story. The Lord is going to reclaim them from exile. He is going to restore them as his covenant people and accomplish his purposes for them. In the process, he's going to glorify Jerusalem as the center of his earthly kingdom. And he's going to accomplish this restoration of his people, which we read about in Isaiah 40 through 66, where Isaiah actually projects himself into the future and talks to the future exiles as if he were there. That's why so many scholars feel like, well, Isaiah couldn't have written this. Someone living at that later time must have written this. I don't see it that way. I think Isaiah has prophesied the exile, and now he is going to speak to those exiles. And he tells them, God has not given up on you. You're not in exile because of some failure on God's part. He is superior to the gods of Babylon and the nations, and he's going to deliver you. And his primary instrument in bringing about this restoration is the ideal Israel, the new Moses, the ideal prophet, the ideal king. And we, of course, know him as Jesus Christ. So Jesus is central to the message of Isaiah. He doesn't name him by name, but he is pointing to him, especially in the so-called servant songs of Isaiah, the most famous of which is Isaiah 53, which describes the servant's suffering that makes it possible for God to renew his covenant relationship with his people. So, in a nutshell, Isaiah is all about how God has to discipline his covenant people for their rebellion, but how he then restores them through his ideal servant and accomplishes his purposes and his goal for them. And the second part of your question, how Isaiah fits into the larger message of Scripture, Isaiah is central to what God is doing. If we go all the way back to Genesis 1 through 11, what happens? God creates humankind, wants to have a relationship with them, but right away they rebel against him. In fact, things get so bad that God needs to bring the flood and destroy humankind, with the exception of Noah and his family. Starts over with them. But by the time we get to the Babel incident in Genesis 11, once again people are rebelling and God has to scatter them. So we have creation, and then we have rebellion, and we really have curse and discord. The human race is not unified. They're living under this curse that we read about in Genesis 3. So what does God do? Well, he chooses Abraham to be his instrument, whereby he is going to restore his relationship with the human race. Makes some amazing promises to Abraham. And in fact says that through Abraham, he is going to bless humankind. So that as the story unfolds, Abraham's descendants, through Isaac and Jacob, Israel, is God's chosen instrument. And so God chooses this nation. He delivers them from bondage in Egypt. We have the Exodus. he establishes his covenant relationship with Israel, hoping to bless them. In fact, in Deuteronomy it says, if you obey, you'll be blessed in this way, but if you disobey, these covenant curses will fall upon you, culminating in exile. So God does an act really of new creation. He creates a nation, makes a covenant with them. We have the Exodus, but Israel fails, as we know. That's the story of the Old Testament all the way through the historical books, and the writing prophets talk about this. The nation failed. And so once again, God's purposes seem to be thwarted through the rebellion of his people, and we end up in curse and discord as Israel is in exile. And that's where Isaiah fits in. As we discussed just a few minutes ago, the book is all about God restoring his people, and he's going to do that through this servant who's described in the second part of the book. He also appears in the first part of the book, but there he's this ideal Davidic king who is going to rule over God's world, in like Isaiah chapter 11 is a classic passage that describes him. But this servant is actually called Israel in the second servant song in Isaiah 49. And that's why some people will say, well, the servant is just Israel. But wait a minute. Israel is in exile because of their sins. They can't deliver anybody. And when you read further on in Isaiah 49, you realize the servant who's addressed as Israel is going to save Israel. So how can Israel save Israel? Well, the servant in the songs is the ideal Israel, who is going to deliver the less than ideal, sinful nation that is in exile. And then we get to the third song, and this whole concept of suffering is introduced, and we get to the fourth song in Isaiah 53, and we realize that this servant is going to take God's punishment upon himself, and he is going to pay the price for the sins of exiled Israel. And he is going to be an instrumental figure in bringing Israel back to God. And he wears a lot of hats. He's pictured as ideal Israel, but he's also a new Moses. He's going to lead a new Exodus. He is a prophet, and he's also going to bring justice to the earth, which is what the ideal Davidic king pictured in Isaiah 11 is going to do. So he's a very important character in what God is doing in the world. And this ideal servant is going to submit to God. In contrast to humankind, going all the way back to the beginning of Genesis, in contrast to Israel and their story throughout the Old Testament, this servant, the ideal Israel, is going to submit to God, even to the point of suffering. And so he becomes a pivotal character. And then we read about in Isaiah how he is going to lead this new Exodus. He's going to deliver God's people from bondage, and he is going to establish a new covenant with them. So the problem of Israel's rebellion is taken care of. But we also read in those songs how he is going to be a light to the nations, and he is going to bring justice to the earth, and God's salvation to the world. And even in Isaiah 53, yes, the servant is suffering for Israel, but he's also suffering for the many, language that I think Paul picks up on in Romans. And so the work of the servant is broader in scope than just Israel, and he is going to restore the nations to God. And it's interesting that the book of Isaiah ends in chapter 65 and 66 with a vision of a new creation, which involves the restoration of Jerusalem and God's people, but it's a new creation. And so God is restoring the human race as well. And so hopefully as I worked through that and outlined it, you can see how Isaiah's message is pivotal in the biblical meta-narrative to understanding what God is doing.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, when you think about Isaiah and being such a pivotal work, this next question may be a little more difficult to answer, but maybe not. What would you say are the major theological themes covered then? How might you articulate what 2, 3 major themes in Isaiah?
Well, I divide the theology of Isaiah up into God and his people, and by that I mean Israel. God and his covenant people and how he relates to them, and then God and the nations.
Okay.
And so under the umbrella of God and his people, we have 2 major themes: judgment, sin and judgment. So much of the book is about how Israel has failed in their covenant responsibilities. They've been disobedient. They've worshiped other gods. They have engaged in social injustice. They have not loved God, and they have not loved their fellow brother and sister. They failed in that regard. They've broken the law. And because of that, God is going to implement the covenant curses against them. He's going to come and judge them. But his judgment is not final. And there's always this silver lining. God's judgment is designed to purify his people. So we have the theme of sin and judgment, but we also have the theme of salvation and restoration. And God is going to restore his people to proper covenant relationship. He's going to raise up an ideal Davidic king who is going to rule from Jerusalem. Jerusalem is going to be the center of God's rule on the earth. And so those are the major themes under the rubric of God and his people. Sin and judgment, but also salvation. And really, those same themes appear with regard to God and the nations. The nations are in rebellion against God. And God is going to judge the nations. And there's a section of Isaiah 13 through 27 where God is going to judge the various nations of Isaiah's time. That's 13 through 23. But then you get to chapters 24 through 27, which is sometimes called the Little Apocalypse. It's a short version of Revelation, as it were, where God is going to judge the world for its sin. But he's going to restore the world as well as he sets up his rule on the earth. And so the nations have sinned. They're going to experience God's judgment, but they too are going to be recipients of God's salvation. So Isaiah is all about how God is going to bring his purposes for this world and for the people he has created to fruition. He's going to accomplish what he set out to do.
Okay. Well, all right, so here I am. I'm a pastor.
Yeah.
And I'm working on my preaching schedule.
Right.
And I say to myself, I think it's time I preach one of the prophets. How might I contemplate including Isaiah into my preaching schedule and perhaps preach the book of Isaiah? What suggestions would you give to me?
Well, if you embark on a verse-by-verse, chapter-by-chapter
it's going to be a long time.
You're going to be in Isaiah for a long, long time. Now, Isaiah is a very deep book theologically, and I actually believe that a pastor could do it. He could go through 66 chapters consecutively, and he would find plenty there that would be applicable to his audience. But then again, that's a long series, and I think the trend these days is to go for shorter series. And so what I've done in teaching Isaiah is I have gone for highlights, key passages that really bring out the themes the most clearly. I think that you could do chapters 1 through 12 probably consecutively. There's so many famous verses in there. I mean, in chapter 2, you've got the beating the swords into plowshares and the peaceful kingdom that God is going to bring to the earth. Of course, Isaiah 7, the Emmanuel prophecy, and how this historical Emmanuel was a type, a foreshadowing of this greater king to come, who's described in Isaiah 9. These are famous passages known through Handel's Messiah to many people. The government will be on his shoulder. He's going to be the Prince of Peace. That's Isaiah chapter 11, where the predators are going to lie down with the animals that they normally prey on, the lion, the lamb, all of that. Those are famous passages. And so I think you could actually work through chapters 1 through 12 probably consecutively, but again, maybe skipping over some sections. When you come to 13 through 23 and you've got the oracles against all these individual nations, that would be harder to do. And so I think maybe one message on that section that would summarize the overall theme, that God holds the nations accountable, not just his covenant people Israel. He holds the nations accountable for obeying him. That little section 24 through 27 that we mentioned earlier, the little apocalypse, lots of famous passages in there. As well, the death of death in chapter 25, which I think has impacted New Testament descriptions of God's victory over death, the final enemy. So I think you could work that section pretty easily. 28 through 39, maybe more highlights, and same thing with 40 through 66. But I think a pastor could spend 2-3 months in Isaiah just looking at key highlights, passage, and still give the people a good feel for the overall message of the book. Mm-hmm. Certainly the servant songs, when you get into Isaiah. Isaiah 40 is a great passage about the sovereign creator who is so far superior to the gods of the Babylonians, and how he still cares for his people and how he is going to energize them. They're going to rise up with wings of eagles. And then the servant songs in 42 and 49 and 50 and, of course, 53. And I think there's a fifth servant song in chapter 61, the passage that Jesus read in the synagogue when he said, "Today, this scripture is fulfilled in your ears." And so there's lots of really, really encouraging passages in Isaiah. But I think a pastor could do a good job in the book for 2-3 months.
Okay, all right. Well, okay, so here I am. I've decided to preach the book of Isaiah.
The whole book?
I'm gonna take your recommendation.
Okay.
And what would be some sources that I might use, or sources that you might be aware of that are in process and might be out within a couple of years?
Well, I'll mention the pending ones, forthcoming ones, in a second. John Oswalt has written a couple of really good commentaries on Isaiah. One in the NICOT series, the New International Commentary on the Old Testament. That's a 2-volume work, and that it's very exegetical. But he also wrote the NIV application commentary on Isaiah, which is designed, I think, more for pastors who are wanting to preach. But if you have both of Oswalt's commentaries, I think you'd find them helpful. Gary Smith, also an evangelical scholar. Gary wrote a fine 2-volume commentary on Isaiah in the New American Commentary series, very up-to-date, very useful. As well. So those are two that I find helpful. Over on the British side, Motier, I think it's John Motier, wrote a commentary on Isaiah that is well done and valuable. So those are three that I have found helpful. Now, if we're talking about forthcoming volumes, I'm actually writing a commentary on Isaiah for Kriegel. It's going to be part of the K-Rooks series, which is designed again for pastors. I'll be teaming up with a homiletician, a preacher. We're not sure who that is at this point, but I'll be doing the exegetical theological portion of the commentary, keeping in mind themes for pastors, and then I'll pass off my work to my teammate, who is will be an accomplished homiletics professor who teaches preaching and preaches a lot and has a good feel for what a pastor faces each week. Whoever we choose for that role, he'll be a good one. We'll make sure of that. And he will take my work and package it for pastors and talk about preaching strategies and that sort of thing. So we're very excited about the K-Rooks commentary series. It's going to be the entire Bible done in this fashion, and I've already done quite a bit of work on Isaiah, but I'll be doing more work this summer and then next year when I'm on sabbatical, working on that series as well.
Okay.
So,
okay. Yeah. Well, Bob, thank you for joining with us and sharing with us a little bit of Isaiah. For those of you who are aware of a conference we hold yearly in September in northern Indiana, Bob Chisholm will be coming and speaking in 2016 at the Let's Know the Bible Conference in Warsaw, Indiana. The conference is going to focus on sticks, stones, and broken bones for God, an exposition of the book of Isaiah. So that'll be coming up next year, September 10th, 2016, and perhaps we will see you there. In the meantime, I trust that you will have a great day, and till next time, goodbye.